Simon Dixon, welcome, man.
Thank you for having me.
Simon, there's a lot going on in the world. Can you tell us a little bit about who really runs the world and what that structure is to that framework?
Yeah, and Bitcoin has always been macro geopolitics. Like, it was a resistance movement against the central banking system, so it's always been that. And it really needs to be understood in that context. And that's the reason why, I found it, because I was analyzing how I thought the world worked based upon genuine power dynamics, because most people think of like governments being in charge, and most people think of media as a tool for sharing news or holding governments to account. I found that both have been captured by private corporate interest. And so the main interest is complexes. And so this was very famous. The military-industrial complex is a word that people understand. And I realized that actually there isn't just a military-industrial complex, which consists of a bunch of very important companies across UK, Germany, France, US, Israel, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, Raytheon, and BAE Systems and Elbait Systems. These companies, they have a very well-defined business model. The first time I really understood it was reading the book Confessions of an Economic Hitman, which kind of tied it together from somebody that was involved in going around countries, using war as a mechanism for acquiring resources, subordinating countries, enforcing currencies upon them so that it would then lead back into capital markets. And then there would be a network, a courtocracy, as it were, that would benefit from rebuild contracts, technology contracts, subordination contracts, and extracting resources that were needed to grow industries. As things had evolved, round about the 80s, the financial industrial complex had become a bigger player than the military-industrial complex. The reason is because all of those companies are public companies and they have capital requirements. And so their share price is subordinate to really a constant flow of capital, money printing, and media manipulation to define narratives. And when you understand that, you realize that there's a whole complex. And in the financial industrial complex, it consists with, at the base layer, the banks that create fiat currencies every time they issue a loan. They're vehicles for getting companies and individuals in debt. Then on top of that, there is a investment banking layer, which securitizes and financializes anything and creates derivatives and leverage contracts that subordinate businesses and governments through financial weapons of mass destruction, as it were. And leverage is the key vehicle, and debt's the key vehicle. Now, because it's leveraged in nature, it has a guarantor, which is the central bank. And so whenever anything goes wrong with their bets, you can create pump and dump markets. But these institutions, because they subordinate individuals, companies, and governments, they become too big to fail. And so through this mechanism, a central bank can socialize the losses across all the people and privatize all the gains, and then use those funds in this complex in order to control governments, to control media, turn them all into securities, and subordinate them through these different debt instruments. And then finally, the layer on top of all of that is the asset managers. And so by managing everybody's money, all the government's money, all the central bank's money, all the sovereign wealth funds' money, all the pension funds' money, all the endowment funds' money, all of these different pools of capital, they actually can decide and influence where capital goes. And the interesting thing is that it's global in nature. So whereas a military-industrial complex used to be connected to a country and had somewhat of a nationalistic vision to get the resources back into the corporate interest in that country, the financial industrial complex is apolitical and transnational in nature. It has very important partnerships with sovereign wealth funds all around the world. It has companies like BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard at the asset management layer, JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs at the investment banking layer, Bank of America, Citibank at the retail commercial banking layer. But then it's also all around the world, transnational and global. And even these central banks, they're all shareholders in one central bank called the Bank for International Settlements. And then they put capital around the world through the IMF and the World Bank. And these are all transnational in nature. And one of the very important things that they funded and subordinated was the technical industrial complex. So as the military became more cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, social credit scores, data, programmable money, stablecoins, CBDCs, various other things, technology became, in a sense, more important, potentially more important than capital. And so there's this emerging battle between the legacy military, which has now kind of morphed into the technical industrial complex, Google, Facebook, Palantir, Apple, Microsoft, and then all the global competition as well around that. But all of them need capital. They're all public securities. They all need debt instruments. And they all have derivative complexes around them that can make or break the share price, destroy the wealth or create the wealth for compliant entrepreneurs. And so in this hierarchy, whenever I analyze, I don't analyze in terms of, is the media telling me the truth? I analyze the media in terms of who's funding it and what do they want me to believe and what is the reason for that. Not that it's true. Is why are they pushing that narrative now? What agenda does it serve? And whenever I look at a politician is simply somebody that works for a lobby, which is the interest of the Fick, Mick, and Tick. So I'll call them that from now on.
So we'll just recap. So the military-industrial complex builds the weaponry and the systems.
Mm-hmm.
The financial-industrial complex finances it. They're in charge of capital.
Mm-hmm.
And then we've got the technological industrial complex.
Yeah.
And they're building basically the technical layer, what we see on the internet and with AI now as a new emerging sort of technical
control grids, I call it.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah. So they're the control grids. They govern. We're all spending all of our time staring at a screen, a laptop,
Mm-hmm.
an iPad, and everything we do is providing data for these control grids, and we have to. There's no opt out of that. In order to be productive and function today, you have to maximize that as an individual or as a business. So this is a capture control grid.
Well, actually, if you do opt out, and there are various tools where you've got to go to some lengths to do that, that's actually cause for suspicion. There was a professor in the States who was who came on the suspicion because he was taking walks without his phone. And so as that campus and his department was being monitored, they started to wonder why his phone was never leaving his office. And then as a result of that, he became a suspect in an investigation. And I think they trumped up some charges about him leaking some classified information as well. He may have been in some sort of program, but yeah, it was just the fact that he wasn't taking his phone with him was cause for suspicion. So you can imagine sometime in the future where police pull you up and they're like, phones please, and you don't have your phone. And it's like, well, we have to detain you now because why don't you have your phone?
Yeah, and there are countries at which that is really becoming more and more prevalent, particularly in the UK and Europe at the moment. And so that's kind of the state of many affairs in other countries around the world where they beta test this stuff. But it's moving westwards, and it's coming home, as it were. And yeah, these are So when I think of politicians, I just think of they work for lobbies. But they have to create a narrative of why they're working for the people. So the whole job of a politician is to be useful for lobbies, but generate a narrative to make the people think you're working for them. And the degree at which you're successful of that gives you access to more lobby money. So if you can serve the lobby to a greater degree and make people believe you're working for them, then eventually you become somebody that may be a presidential candidate like Trump. So he has a cult following called MAGA, but he serves the financial industrial complex. And he has the ability to produce a narrative that makes these people think he's working for them while he's working for them. And that is somebody. And in order to get to that level of success, you also have to be compromised.
Well, it's really interesting you said that, because especially drawing on the example of Diary of an Economic Hitman, where it's always about the resources, always about control of resources. And yet every single war is sold on these sort of liberal humanitarian grounds of spreading democracy, human rights, protect the children. And we're seeing that right now, where the media narrative pushed for the war in Iran was, what is it? For the people of Iran,
we're liberating the people. We care about women's rights.
Exactly, women's rights. And, you see these images of Iran before the Islamic Revolution, so to speak. And you're like, hang on, why are we always pushed a particular image of Iran? And it was only since the war that we're starting to see people posting videos of everyday life in Iran. And like, that doesn't look too different from where we live, to be honest with you. Like, their shopping centers are like our shopping centers. Now, of course, there are many things that are different from it, but why is only such a small angle pushed to dehumanize an entire region? And it's just the differences between what that industrial complex framework that the network of interests, what they push and what they seek, contrasted with how those wars are actually sold to the general population, which is always, we're helping the people.
Yeah.
We want girls to go to school and such. And it's like, hang on a minute. Iran's got a higher literacy rate than we do. They've got most of their university graduates are women, most of them.
Yeah.
It's like by a significant margin. And they have women in all sorts of professions as well. Now, we can criticize many aspects of Iranian society and the ruling structure as well, but not exclusively. We can't just do that exclusively and focus on the things we don't like and then go, well, let's go to war then.
Yeah, and therein is your understanding of the media. So that the media is a captured tool that is used in order to create narratives, through, whenever you read an article and it says an unknown source, well, who is that unknown source? Is that a CIA? Is that an economic hitman?
Yeah.
Who is it?
Well, interestingly, as Trump was nearing one of his many deals, I think the initial ceasefire agreement, and one of the mainstream media journalists asked him, aren't you betraying the people of Iran?
Yeah.
And I was gobsmacked by that. Do you think the people of Iran want their nation to be destroyed and bombed? Is that what you're thinking?
Absolutely not, because there are paid agents as well to create narratives. And so if you look back at the interesting thing is we can look back at history, at declassified documents, and see what's really happening today. And so everything that happened today in Iran happened in 1953, and it's declassified, and it involved the CIA, it involved MI6, it involved them actually going into the country and shooting people, manufacturing civil unrest, color revolutions, controlling media in order to portray somebody that they had already set up to be the next leader, which was aligned with British and British Petroleum's interest. And so when you're being told a story, we're exporting democracy, we're standing up for rights, this is just acceptable narrative. And all the politicians play into it because they work for the lobby. And so they're either in a compromise network at the highest level, like an Epstein-style network, where they have something on them, or they're just simply in the grooming phase, which is someone like J.D. Vance, who was groomed by Peter Thiel. He was given VC capital. They changed his name. They made him out like he was a veteran or something, but he works for Palantir. And his job is to get government contracts and data if he ever succeeds. And if he doesn't, you initially give him some money, and his job is to be useful for the lobby and create a narrative that relates to the people. And if he succeeds at that, then he gets more funding. And so, but where are even the policies written? The policies are written by a network of non-governmental organizations and think tanks. And so if you want to look at any of the policies, they refer to research, but they captured the universities and colleges as well. And so the research, the things that get published at the university college level serve a corporate agenda. Does it push vaccines? Does it push, this type of drug innovation and research? Does it push people into focusing on a particular school of economics that encourages debt? Keynesian economics. Classical economics, which encourages central banks as a tool.
So then you have the intellectual framework for the agenda.
Yes, and these are, it starts right at the very beginning, at the school level. The education is infiltrated. Then you end up at college and university. And what do you end up with? You end up with an indoctrinated, base of research that is corporate sponsored in order to get into the publications that give it the credibility. Mm-hmm. You've got professors which you can capture, through these networks as well, and then you have, you've captured all these different tools. Then that research is used to push out non-governmental organizations and think tanks. And then those think tanks are funded in order to achieve a particular corporate agenda sponsored by that company. Then it makes its way to the captured politicians. The politicians put it forward as changes that need to happen, but you need a media narrative to make it look like it's something else. A classic example is, the Club of Rome, 1968, Rockefeller-funded, covert think tank and policy institution. They wanted to do depopulation. They also were the same group that said, let's make global warming something that we blame it on the people, because all the actions that you're taking is causing the global warming. So research was created, and then you had like Inconvenient Truth and the Al Gore documentaries. You radicalize a bunch of people into believing that this is because of us and our action. And then you create left and right narrative where you can fund both sides to the same outcome, but with a different thing. And then the people are all distracted saying, I'm a radical left, I'm a far right. Then the economic thought comes along with that. Communism, capitalism, socialism. These are all constructs of the same, architecture. And there's a very sophisticated brainwashing mechanism that is indoctrinated into us at the captured education level, all the way through to university and colleges. And we buy into these ideologies, but in the end, there's just like China, there's a, say on top of this, there's a financial industrial complex that never changes, and the policy goes across politician to politician. And even the whole concept of democracy, it was, again, something you can buy into as an ideology, but it never does what it says that it's going to do, because there is a uniparty agenda by financial powers that are doing a multi-decade strategy. Like the transition from one empire to the other is like a century-long strategy. That's how the Chinese Communist Party does, but it's overt. This is covert. And so you end up with the same thing. And so what you end up looking around the world, when I look at geopolitics, I look at which countries manage to keep the resources that give them negotiation leverage. And so if you look at Saudi and Iran, when I'm analyzing them, I'm saying, do they have a manufacturing base? Do they have their own military industrial complex? Do they have national resources, oil, which will obviously be indoctrinated into your mind? Oh, that's communism. That's oppression. And I'm not saying that they're not, because when you're constantly being infiltrated by external forces, and you have the threat of being overthrown, and you might be an implant in yourself, because these leaders are groomed, the dictators are groomed. They're installed. Shah is an example. US interest. Some people believe that Khomeini represents British interest from his times when he was with MI6 in France in exile. Some people have different thoughts. These are all very deceitful mechanisms. But when I analyze a country, I'm like, how sovereign can they be, and how much negotiation leverage do they have to fend off the empire? And that's why you always see, whenever a country is about to be attacked, the main financial weapons of mass destruction that are used is the FX markets, the currency markets, the stock markets, the bond markets, and sanctions as a mechanism for subordination. And then you install at the most extreme, if you can't replace the leader with a puppet or a dictator, then you destroy the economy through sanctions, currency wars, and inflation. And if you can't get the resources then at the extreme, you then go to the blackmail networks. And if you can't get them that way, which is why you end up with countries with dictators where all the money is concentrated in the power and the people have nothing. In Africa's the many different countries in Africa with the lots of resources. And then at the end, if somebody defies Gaddafi, in Libya, Saddam Hussein in Iraq, then you send the MIC in. And the goal of the MIC is a very sophisticated business model as well. It's not destroy the country to get the resources. It is business. It is a stock market stimulus in order to spend as much money as possible. So you then might think, well, I'm part of the empire. I'm okay with that. But no, the scam is on you too. So the scam of central banking, and this is what drives us into a Bitcoin conversation and a monetary conversation, you realize that the job of MIC, TIC, and FIC, the job of FIC is to turn individuals into collateralized debt obligations through student debt, through credit card debt, through mortgages.
So lifelong debt slaves.
Lifelong
right?
debt.
Yeah.
You earn enough money to cover your interest, but your wages never go up at the same rate as inflation. So you're always getting further and further behind unless you work harder, put more in. And then eventually, if you want to beat that cycle, you either have to become an investor or a business owner. Once you become a business owner, you need their capital, venture capital, private equity. And then if you succeed, you become a public company. Then you get access to debt capital market. And then you're fully subordinate, where you own like 5-10% of your company. You have a board that's installed by the asset managers. You have regulatory capture, and you climb that ladder where the governance takes over. You no longer have your own company. And then, of course, socialize the losses and privatize the debt is, if it all goes wrong, just dump it on the government. And so the government has to do the bailout. The bailout removes any concept of free market capitalism that we were taught we were doing in the university, without pricing, without corrections. But what happens with every crisis that they manufacture? Wealth concentrates upwards and upwards and upwards and upwards. And those on the wages end up further and further down. Until eventually it creates the type of environment of civil unrest, because wealth inequality is too far, too great. And then they work on the next operation, which is change the empire, hedge capital, manufacture civil unrest, build a police and surveillance state, build control grids, and then destroy the economy. And by destroying the economy, we get to take all those resources, put them somewhere else, buy them on the cheap, asset strip them, and set up the next game.
So we've gone through the various industrial complexes, military, financial, technological. Do you view the deep state as being a competing center of power with those various complexes? Or do you also think that's part of government which is captured?
Yeah, think of a mafia. There is an overarching structure, and your job is to preserve the structure. But then you've got egotistical maniacs that say, I want to overthrow the mafia. And so a new power structure can be created within these shadow power structures. Mm-hmm. And so somebody might want to dethrone Jamie Dimon from JP Morgan. So they create their own game of how to achieve that. And then they try and capture people into that new game. So on top of this, it's the whole game is preservation of structure, which is why everyone has to be compromised to rise to the top. It's like in the mafia, you have to shoot someone as your initiation so that they've got you, and then the higher you want to go, the more compromised you have to be.
So a company like BlackRock, though, they're a relatively new entrant into this game, but now they're pretty much one of the most dominant forces in the financial industrial complex. How does a company like that emerge and then entrench itself as basically one of the top players?
Yeah, so BlackRock emerged in the 80s. I think it was decided that previously the main mechanism was currency wars. I think they wanted to test a model of capital wars. And so BlackRock today has several key assets which make it more important than other nodes in the FIC. One of them is they simply got more assets under management. And so there is a competition between BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, Fidelity, and foreign nodes as well to get more capital. And that's a ruthless game. You can play that game and you can try and dethrone another asset manager and become top dog. So there's competition there. There certainly is. But there are chosen, and this is where the tick comes in. If you look at the history of technology, it tends to be somebody. So an executive is not the top dog. They work for the board. The board works for the shareholders. So the shareholder class are the top. Then you've got the board, which work for the shareholders. And then you have the executives. So Larry Fink is the CEO. Very important character, public facing, but works for the board and works for the shareholders. And so his job is to get as much assets under administration, so, and then the tick, you get to select the type of entrepreneurs and board seats that can take government Pentagon-funded technology that was innovated for killing people and privatize it. So Palantir, Google, Tesla's, like all of the innovation, Apple, all of the innovation behind all of this was created through Pentagon budgets for killing people. And the MIC would test it all around the world. And then there would be a private-public partnership set up. And you would groom your entrepreneur that was going to get access to that technology, whether it be space technology, whether it be GPS, whether it be Palantir, military technology. And you're going to slowly, so the military use it first, and then you create companies where your job is to commercialize it and roll it out to everybody else. So then you get an iPhone, then you get a laptop, then you get GPS with maps and everything. And so your job is now to roll out where you've got the data on everybody, but you're still subordinate to, FIC. You get a public company. And so the technology is kind of transferred into a public-private partnership. The founding team are groomed, and they rotate as well. So BlackRock has 20,000 board seats across all the different major companies around the world. What else do they have? They have a technology which they were developed and grew within that structure. And this is whether it's covert, overt, natural market, not quite sure. But they ended up with Aladdin.
So tell us what Aladdin is first.
Aladdin is all of the best data of every market that is utilized by every single fund manager, every single bond trader, every single hedge fund, every single central bank. Not every single, but you know what I'm saying, a lot. Mm-hmm. Most central banks, most sovereign wealth funds, most treasury departments, most endowment funds, most pension funds, every major pool of capital. In fact, if you take the customers, it's $25 trillion of capital that is subscribed to Aladdin. And Aladdin is the most sophisticated financial artificial intelligence that exists in the world.
But how does something like that get a grip with such market dominance? Where are all the other major players with their models? And so, for example, we're looking at the AI, the AI companies, right? From OpenAI to, Google DeepMind was for the longest time presumed to be in a position to dominate AI for a decade or more. And that was one of the fears that led Elon Musk to funding OpenAI initially as a charitable charity fund, and that's since been commercialized by Altman. But, at least there was competition that emerged. And then from OpenAI, there was the founder of Anthropic who left. And now Anthropic is a serious challenger to become the number one AI company in the world. With BlackRock's Aladdin, why haven't we seen the emergence of another model to challenge that? Because if it's data and then it's sort of AI technology that runs that, surely there's enough talent in the world to develop alternative models to compete with that as well.
Yeah, and it's because of the subordination layer and network. So you got the board seats. So now remember, the executives answer to the board. Then you've got the public venture capital funds. You've got nodes like founders funds in Silicon Valley, all the Peter Thiel stuff. Their job is to scoop up everything, like all the potentials, groom them. Then you've got capital requirements. So even if you're at the venture capital level, where you think you'll go into Founders Fund is highly leveraged in the private credit market. And leverage buyout market as well. So even Peter Thiel, that looks like the billionaires that everyone's talking about, their net worth is subordinate to FIC because it consists of public companies, access to capital, access to debt markets at cheaper rates, which give them their edge in order to maybe have the VC money so that then they can find the best and then install their board members. So as soon as you get capital, you get their board member, right? So this is the slow mechanism for doing it. So you've got the board. Then you've got the capital flows at the public level. So this is where BlackRock made some really interesting moves. So BlackRock, through its network of connections in the 2008 global financial crisis, was contracted to manage who goes bust and who gets bailed out, and access to the capital that would fund it. And so we had the biggest bailout event. And who did BlackRock end up acquiring? They ended up with legacy London ETF flows, which was Barclays had to sell their ETF division to BlackRock. And they got access to the capital to acquire it. And so BlackRock was a transfer of wealth to the US stock market from the UK stock market. And so this was, they ended up with all of the legacy ETF fund management flows from the previous empire. And you need to manufacture a crisis in order to get that. So if you're connected to the Fed, and then the Fed gives you a contract to manage the global financial crisis bailout, and you put all of the assets to favor Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, and BlackRock, which is effectively what happened, then it was they increase their power, they increase their capture, which increases their lobby ability, which increases their connections in these shadow networks. And what are the ETFs? ETF means that there are people all around the world that are saying, I don't want to pick what stock to buy. Just give me the S&P 500. And I don't want to deal with any of these complicated. There's more ETFs than stocks now, and so you passively say, give me exposure to this. Then BlackRock says, sure, here's a product, but give us your voting rights. We might give you some proxy system. And you want one of our board members to manage your interest. And so BlackRock is a mechanism for soaking up all the capital and getting the voting rights and the board seats. So now you've got companies like right now, we got a SpaceX IPO, and they're changing the rules. Elon is saying, if we're a $1 trillion IPO, we want to be included in the index from day one, which means you get the BlackRock capital from day one. That wasn't the rules before. We're changing the rules. And so now you've got these $1 trillion IPOs.
So tell us about what the rules were before. I think there's a certain number of days you need to trade.
Yeah, and that's another control grid right away. There's regulatory capture, which is do the crime and pay the fine. Mm-hmm. If you look at every every crime you do with the regulator, it just ends up with a fine where you end up making more money by doing the crime and paying the fine. But the indexes are a big, factor. And if you look back at all of these structures, like even the SEC, it's a private corporation. The Federal Reserve is owned by the banks. The settlement layers, DTCC for the shares, it's all owned by the banks and the clearing houses. So if you look down to the shareholder class, they've captured the whole thing. It's just very, but yeah, the indexes are, it gives you really big influence over capital flows. And so by including a company in an index, you're going to get a structural bid every single day, from all of these flows of passive money, but managed by the ETF provider.
So there are a lot of funds in the world that are mandated to invest.
Yes.
Certain percentages based on the index weightings, and that's when you refer to passive flows.
Yes. So somebody using BlackRock's Aladdin, the largest pension fund manager, managers in the world, or sovereign wealth funds, they're just simply saying, for this profile of client, what is the right mix of debt and equity and alternative commodities or something like that? And they're all just vehicles for managing that. And their job is to beat the index. And if they underperform the index, they get taken down and replaced by somebody else. And so this is the beating, your ability to beat or underperform or overperform the index is the determination. So of whether you succeed or not. And often it's based upon inside information, So we're seeing right now around the Iran war, ginormous capital flows that predate every single Truth Social post. That's the financial industrial complex connected to the administration that knows what Trump's going to post before he posts it. And that's why you can look at the markets and determine, is this a real war? Is this a fake war? What are the real insiders saying? They're saying that this is managed transition. You can look at all the capital flows and predate the narrative. And then this gets back to the original conversation. I don't listen to what they say. I listen to what they want me to believe. I look at the money and the capital flow. And then you've got two indicators. What are the politicians lying to you about? And everything's a lie. And if it matches capital, then it's the truth. If it doesn't match capital, then it's a lie, which is 99% of the time. And which different media outlets are connected to which faction of power? Because there are, these are competitive games that happen. But the index fund is really a new tool for currency wars. So getting back to why BlackRock, well, I will never be able to answer it conclusively, but it looks like there was an element of grooming and selection in either BlackRock got to that position or was groomed from day one to be in that position. But now they got $25 trillion of assets that every fund manager can scenario plan. So you can go to BlackRock's Aladdin and say, what's the most likely outcome and likelihood of the Strait of Hormuz closing? And if it does, and if it lasts for this long, that long, this long, how should I allocate my capital? And so BlackRock will push it out to the network, and then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so they got 25 trillion, which is why we got fake markets. And all the media outlets are public companies as well, which are fully captured for narrative. It's why NVIDIA, let's stop talking about earnings per share. Let's stop talking about PE ratios. We need to capture the narrative to say we are in an AI arms race with China. And if we don't put data centers in space, then for national security, we're going to lose the AI arms race and China's going to rule the world and it's an Orwellian central bank digital currency authoritarian regime.
Well, it was interesting. You just mentioned that because just last week we saw Kevin O'Leary go on the airwaves, and his argument against every concern was, well, do you want China to win? And so someone's expressing concern about mass unemployment, and he's like, well, do you want China to win? And it's like, hang on a minute. If I can't put food on the table, why do I give a shit if China's winning? Because I've lost.
Yeah.
Like, who do I like? I'm not cheering for anyone on the TV set.
Yeah.
I need to put food on the table. I need to buy a house. I need to raise a family. I need to do all these very essential things to my humanity and my reason for being.
Yes.
And you're prompting me to cheerlead for one entity over another. So what difference does it make if I'm unemployed and destitute if my country wins?
Yeah. And FIC is masters at setting up a game theory and setting up incentives to drive capital and outcomes in the direction that they need. Because they also have access to the deep state, because the deep state was the construct of the military-industrial complex, and the deep state are able to, if you can't capture them through funding, then capture them through blackmail. And if you can't capture them through blackmail, capture them through violence. And if you can't, and if they still don't, then just eliminate. And so you get assassinations.
Well, we saw that with Charlie Kirk.
Yes.
Right? I know a lot of people have theories. My theory is they killed him. Who killed him? Vested interests killed him. I don't think it was a lunatic, someone from, the far left fringe or whatever. I think that was an assassination.
Well, here's the sophistication of this as well. They know how to weaponize everything, because this is like multi-decades in the making. So leaving people guessing around what happened to Charlie Kirk is also a monetizable data set, where you get everyone putting their theories on what happened. You're feeding the algorithm. That's data. It's really interesting data that can be used to manipulate, in these operations as well. Also, when to destroy an empire or make an empire, by revealing how it works. So we're at the revealing stage at the moment, because the FIC is investing in a multipolar world. The TIC is investing in a one world government current control grid with China.
So let's get into that. You've done a fantastic job of laying out the groundwork and the framework for analyzing what we're about to go into now, which is what is essentially happening in the world. And Charlie Kirk is a perfect example of what, for us to lead into that discussion, because we've seen a demonstration of what happens when you go up against these industrial complexes and oppose one of their agenda items. We are now in the midst of a tenuous ceasefire between Iran, Israel, and the United States. You have a very interesting take on what's happening there. And let me just say right from the outset, I find it fascinating. I think many of the outcomes that you've shared with me previously, I think they're going to happen. I'm not so sure that it's all theatre, because that's one of your claims as well, is that a lot of it is managed theatre to get to an outcome that's predetermined. Can you tell us, first of all, tell us what you're seeing? Why did this war start against Iran? Why did United States and Israel, led by Israel, start this war, launch this war on Iran? And where do you think it's going?
So you got to get a bit of history of Iran. Iran is a country that wanted to utilize its oil so that it didn't have to tax its people. And it wanted to remain a sovereign country with 6,000 years of cultural history. And it's had, many attempts to try and overthrow its previous Persian empires. And so it's got all of that historical context. But the world that's useful to us really only comes into play around World War I, World War II, and the post-empire that's being dismantled now. And so Iran wanted to effectively went through that transition from British Empire to American Empire, and then a revolution in order to try and preserve its own nationalistic interest. And so that's the entire history of Iran in its simplest form in the context of what we're discussing. Around that, there's lots of things, ideology, there's lots of emotion, there's lots of the narrative that you were taught, and all sorts of stuff. But in its simplest thing, if we get it down to this framework. And so in 1953, the CIA and MI6 engineered exactly what we saw today: currency wars, inflation wars, and weaponizing media in order to use kill people and blame it on the ruthless regime. And then the ruthless regime is defending against, in today, Mossad mainly, MI6 and CIA, which turns you into, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy because you're constantly on the defense of defending your power structure.
Well, we've seen that with, there was a concerted effort since admitted by Israel's intelligence agencies that they were supporting and prompting a so-called uprising in Iran prior to the launch of the war. And, they provoked that, and then the state reinforces law and order because you've got a bunch of people firing, kamikaze drones and RPGs, and, they're going out onto the street with weaponry.
Yeah.
Well, of course, any country would, reinstate law and order, but then that was used as a pretext for the war, supposedly because Iran killed 30 or 40,000 civilians, which never happened.
And it's disingenuous because if you want to compare one where it was genuine, Syria is an example of one where it was planned properly.
Mm-hmm.
And so, Turkey funded the rebels. It's got state sponsorship.
The rebels being effectively Al-Qaeda.
So it's these different groups, they rebrand themselves continually. They're just paid militia that the highest intelligence agency can run, and they come with a religious narrative so that you can hide what they're actually doing. And so if you look around the world, all this ISIS, Al-Qaeda, M23, M13, they're just people that the soldiers probably think they're working for something else, but at the leadership level, they're funded by state sponsors, and those state sponsors have agendas. And so the game of all these different groups is they're open to anyone that is able to recruit them. And so, those infamous Hillary Clinton email leaks where she was celebrating, we got Al-Qaeda, and Julian Assange, which is a Bitcoin story as well, with WikiLeaks. He revealed this in through, whistleblowers that wanted to anonymously share documents to reveal how the system really works. And ISIS is a terrorist factory that is manufactured by Western and Israeli and Mossad assets.
It wasn't apparent at the time, though. That was very effective propaganda to brand them as a very sort of Islamic-driven and oriented organization. But then you had the entire Middle East, in terms of the populations of the Middle East, like aghast at what they were doing in the name of Islam.
Yeah, and so like in the Western narrative, what do you? It's crazy. And if you speak to any Muslim, I don't know Muslims that support ISIS, but even then, these are the victims of war, who's had their children massacred, their grandparents massacred, and they've been radicalized, and they've been tortured, and they are in, at the state level, like you create these cults where they think it's Islam, but actually they're in some radicalized cult. There's cults in Islam that are like connected to the royal family and the crown and stuff, where you have to worship king, like these
in the UK. The UK royal family.
Oh yeah, I met like a guy that was brought up in a cult, like a
Wow.
Pakistani cult that believed that his interpretation of Islam that he was taught, was that he's meant to worship the crown and the royal family. So they weaponize religion. Has always been the tool. So Christian crusaders didn't have much to do with Christianity. It's just a galvanizing force in cults. And so, but it creates a very convenient narrative because in the West, you can do false flags like 9/11.
Mm-hmm.
You can radicalize the local population, even though Osama bin Laden was groomed by the CIA via Saudi intelligence, connected to a Wahhabi tribe, which is what you think Islam is. But that was a manufactured tribe to weaponize Islam with a bunch of people that have been groomed into a cult and told, by the way, this is what, some of them might be illiterate. They don't even know what, you take even like different books, literatures that aren't the Quran, hadiths, and then you say, by the way, this is our hadith, that's our tribe, that's our cult.
Yeah, yeah.
And then it's got nothing to do, and they think that this is the word of God or something.
It's a very sort of modern invention, the Wahhabis sort of, I don't know if you would call it a sect.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, correct. And I don't want to be disrespectful because there are genuine Wahhabis that have got nothing to do with ISIS as well.
Sure,
so it's a very sophisticated thing, but it requires a lot of local knowledge and a local grooming and a local operation. And then that's fun. This is why getting back to the Syria and the Iran situation, the disingenuous part of it, uprisings never happen and these groups never succeed without, ideology has to be state-sponsored or corporate-sponsored. And so the state is sponsored by the corporate and it goes down this network, plausible deniability, NGOs and all sorts of stuff. But those weapons, these are expensive operations. They have to recruit this army. They need the weapons. That requires human trafficking, weapons trafficking. It's often funded by sex trafficking and drugs trafficking. These are the deep state operations. This is why all of those illegal activities are state-sponsored. The cartels work with the governments.
Well, I thought that was really obvious with ISIS because out of nowhere, so there was Al-Qaeda for 10 years or whatever it was, right? No one had ever heard of any other group. And then almost overnight, they emerged with tens of thousands of fighters, thousands of Toyota-mounted machine guns, and basically a fully equipped militia to then take over swaths of the Middle East and, do away with all those borders. It was only when, it became evident what was happening and then finally Russia came in to defeat them in Syria and in Iraq that they were sort of put down. It was obvious to me that was an intelligence-led operation. It was never an organic thing.
And if you follow the money, okay, so you got Osama bin Laden. Mm-hmm. Osama bin Laden was groomed in a covert, let's call it think tank, which was an intelligence corporation called Safari Club. Safari Club had members from Saudi intelligence, various other intelligence groups, French intelligence, British intelligence, and it was really founded, the main member was Bush. And so Bush groomed through Safari Club.
Bush Sr., who was the head of the CIA at one point, right?
Not only the head of CIA, but what's his where did he come from? Oil tycoon. This is oil wealth. And so there you go. It goes right back up. So you've got oil wealth, then you've got captured government, then you've got intelligence apparatus, then you've got MIC, then you've got covert operation, then you groom an enemy, Osama bin Laden, you create Safari Club. If a leader's not cooperating, you assassinate them. That was King Faisal of Saudi Arabia. You then get the petrodollar constructed, feeding back into the FIC, like paying, the dollar being propped up by US treasuries. What happens when Saudi buys those treasuries? They're in the Federal Reserve System, and the yield on those treasuries purchases defense contracts from the MIC. And then they end up with a base. And then they end up being able to defend the oil. And hence you end up in the situation. Now, that's one country. You can go to every single country and these operations. So Saudi, I just explained. Then you have Iran.
So Iran, you were explaining that they wanted sovereignty over their resources to look after their people.
Yes.
And that was in
And they had
contrast.
a democracy. And they didn't like the British intelligence and BP didn't want them to have a democracy because then the people might decide.
Yeah.
And they've got a remnants of a democracy now. It's a theology with a democracy underneath it. You have absolute monarchies with, and dictatorships with the allies of the West. But Iran is the closest to a democracy in the Middle East.
Yeah.
I mean, they always paint Israel as the poster child. But even this one.
That's a really interesting point you just made, because when the media solely focuses on Iran, it picks out the things that that are easy to find objectionable, let's just say. But it's only when you sort of broaden the scope and you say, okay, but we're also allied with countries who are far worse on those things that you point out as being objectionable. So if you want to talk about human rights, There are countries in the Middle East and around the world who are far worse on that count than Iran.
Absolutely.
And they're allied to us. They're
Yeah.
far less democratic, and they're allied to us. And so it doesn't make sense to me that,
Because it's easier to control a dictator than a democracy.
yeah, and we're going back to, the difference between the narrative sold to the population versus the pretext for the war. What is the pretext? Sorry, the subtext for the war. What is the real reason? And going back to what you said before, it's always resource control.
Always. 1953 is an interesting year as well for today, because not only did they do the coup to replace the democracy with the West, the Shah, and the Shah was aligned with British petroleum and American interest in order to do this model to extract all of Iran's resources and make sure that it was utilized for the West. But that was also 1953, I define as the absolute end of the British Empire. And that was marked by the Suez Canal, where the Brits couldn't defend the Suez Canal from Egypt, which was a pan-Arab nationalist uprising. And that was 1953. The end of the British Empire was marked by the moment when Egypt was able to demonstrate the world's biggest naval fleet could not protect the canal. So anyway, in Iran they installed the Shah. The Shah was brutal. His job was to extract resources for Western interests. The nuance in the story is that people look for a bit of a cartoon character, but people change over time because as power changes, and this is the bit that I think people struggle with. This network of FIC is really based. BlackRock's winning right now because they got the most assets under administration, but that can change. And so it's very fluid. And they try and dethrone each other. It's a Game of Thrones up there, but the system preserves so that you can change. It's a mafia. It doesn't matter. You can. There's a brutal game there. But the Shah over time kind of changed his interest as well. Everyone knows that Israel is an implant that was created from the British Crown and the Rothschild family in order to destabilize the region after the French, the Russians, and the British broke up the Middle East through Sykes-Picot and tried to destabilize the region, put all different types of people, create artificial borders that would guarantee war revenue and war profits for the MIC for century.
Sykes-Picot, for people at home, is just a regime of they basically invented new borders to define countries that had never really existed before.
Yeah, so it was an agreement between French and British powers of how to split up and create all these countries called Iran, called Saudi Arabia, called Syria, called Lebanon. They just literally drew lines that they knew would make the most tension, that could have the most potential for divide and conquer. And split resources that may have been known or may not have been known, potential resources, in order to absolutely ensure that they could never unify around those resources, and install dictators that made up the monarchies. But just because a monarchy was installed by the British Empire in the beginning, it doesn't mean the world doesn't change. And this is the bit that people forget to recognize. So, the Shah started to push back against Israel, and because power dynamics were changing. And now, if you look at it today, what's changed? Well, the rise of China is the whole change. The whole change is that America is energy independent if you factor in Canada and Mexico, but it doesn't need any energy from the Middle East. Who needs energy from the Middle East? China does. Does that change the equation? If you are part of a FIC, you as Saudi Arabia, you got your own oil. As Qatar, you got your own LNG. But most of it's being bought by China. Then you're thinking, well, what's this whole petrodollar thing? What am I doing? So I've got all this legacy. There's a defense. There's a base here. I've got this relationship that's maintained the status quo. I'm going to change my strategy probably because America's not buying our energy anymore. In fact, rather than buying their bonds, where I'm lending our dollars to them to uphold a power structure. Why don't I just buy their companies and just buy their shares?
This is a sort of a Gulf perspective the Arab Gulf perspective that you're talking about.
Yeah, back to Iran.
Yeah.
So on the Gulf side, they just started buying their shares.
Mm-hmm.
And what comes with shares? Voting rights, board seats, influence.
Mm-hmm.
That's what changed. And so now the MIC, through FIC, has to cooperate with sovereign wealth funds, which are funded by China. All right. So now you've got transnational capital. And there are leaders in every country, and those leaders are either complying with the FIC or not. And depending on your compliance with the FIC, you are either eliminated, or we launch a war, or we figure out a deal. But that's now for transnational capital. It's not for America, because the MIC was nationalistic. The MIC is subordinate to FIC. FIC is global, and its money is coming from the countries that kept their resources. So the countries that kept their resources, that fund the sovereign wealth funds, are part of FIC. And the biggest node in that is the manufacturing base of China. So that kind of changed everything. But anyway, so then you had a revolution in 79, which was, you can look at documents like Iran-Contra affair. I won't go into it too deeply. But, you had an uprising that made sure that the nationalized oil was protected. And they invested significantly from previous elite alliances with the Shah and the West and America. They had a significant military-industrial complex, but a nationalistic military-industrial complex now. Under the Shah, the military was for the preservation of the extraction of resources for Western interests. Under the post-revolution, you had national resources with the IRGC, and you had a theocracy. And so it's kind of like the perfect tool, right? The theocracy is very easy to criticize in the eyes of the West in a media narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And you had effectively 40 years where Iran could say death to Israel, death to America. Iran could enrich nuclear, their uranium, highly enriched uranium. And it created the perfect justification for MIC. Because on one side you had Israel, on the other side you had Iran and the Islamic Revolution and the IRGC. And they would constantly say things that would justify in the eyes of the West how Iran is trying to kill Americans and kill Israel. And then you can weaponize it to say Jews and all that type of, BS that we had to unwind. And Israel had the constant justification. So then what would Iran do? Well, Iran would side, well, now that we're sanctioned and our economy is being destroyed by the West, we're a target of currency wars. We want to keep our military. We want to keep our national resources. We've built our own independent banking section that's not integrated into the Bank for International Settlements. They built all the tools to remain sovereign. And that's a big problem because they also partnered with China, and China had the manufacturing base, and they also partnered with UAE. UAE created the sanctions circumvention mechanism whereby through the gold markets, oil markets, you could convert your dollars and you could end up with yuan in China. And so the UAE, China, Iran became and via Hong Kong, became this whole preservation of a sanctions circumvention network that was also protected in partnership with mafia groups as well, whether it be the Russian mafia, that allowed for all these shipments to go through. So now you had this whole covert structure that was set up.
Mm.
And interestingly, once they hit later, they started using their nuclear program to mine Bitcoin. And now they're launching insurance services based upon, multi-signature Bitcoin contracts. So this whole rails, and then what did UAE do? UAE set up a network of central bank digital currencies with BIS. And that circumvents SWIFT as well. So while you've got multiple things that are happening here, right? You've got weird thinking about how CBDCs are programmable, horrible money. But from their mechanism, this is a way of preventing sanctions and taking back power from SWIFT. And so all of these currency rails and alternative rails have been built. Now, what does FIC do in that whole time? FIC is thinking, we probably can't stop this. Let's start hedging. Let's use the US MIC while we can to destroy countries and get as much debt in there and as much TIC contracts as we can. Let's try and get our algorithms, data centers, NVIDIA chips, whatever we can. And so they're playing a whole portfolio. They're not an America First agenda. And Iran has kind of become like the Iran and Israel and Iran funding resistance against genuine oppression, like what's happening in Palestine, what's happening in Lebanon, what's happening in Iraq. They created a whole economy of weapons trafficking to these oppressed groups to create resistance for genuine ideological reasons. But from Iran's side, if they could resist and make them very powerful, like Hezbollah, then they could have negotiation leverage in the new world order, which is being currently negotiated. And they have several very important points that they can use and weaponize. And one of those was destroying the global economy through the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. But it's not as simple as it sounds, because if you're the FIC and one of your nodes is Lloyd's of London, then you know that actually insurance market is a vital part of the component of getting shipments through the Strait of Hormuz. And so you could cooperate with a faction of power within Iran. And that's when the simplistic nationalistic kind of ideology breaks down, because there are simply factions of power that are aligned with other factions of power. And that's not necessarily nationalistic, as we've seen in the West. And so through these global networks, you can have Lloyd's of London might have cooperated in closing the Strait of Hormuz. Why? Because it created an energy repricing event and a crisis. Who does that benefit? Well, we know from COVID, global financial crisis, long-term capital management, it creates a socialize the losses, privatize the gains. And anytime you can create inflation crisis, you can price everyone out of their assets and you can concentrate wealth upwards. And so it benefits power in the West at the same time as working with other powers in the Middle East that may not want the US in the region anymore, that were funded by China, who normalized that with Iran.
So let's just stop there and have a bit of a recap, because the way I read it, I think Iran has never really been forgiven by the United States and Britain for defending its sovereignty and overthrowing the Shah, who was imposed upon the country. And as you said, there's a little bit of nuance with his reign, perhaps, in that he did change some of his positions and perhaps became a little bit more hostile towards, for example, Israel during his reign, towards the end of his reign.
As he should.
Yeah. And so throughout that sort of 30 or 40 years, Iran has been punished and constantly antagonized. First of all, with the Iran-Iraq war, that the West was playing both sides essentially, and the whole world was told not to give Iran any kind of weaponry. I recall, was it Zarif, the former foreign minister, Iran's foreign minister, was saying, we begged the whole world for any kind of weaponry, any kind of missiles to help us defend ourselves against Iraq, Saddam Hussein's Iraq. And no one came to our rescue, which was the genesis for their missile program that's now been effectively demonstrated.
And the West gave Iraq chemical weapons.
Chemical
Saddam
weapons,
Hussein to terrorize the Iranians.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of the people you see now, the Iranian politicians you now see on the global stage, they were guys who actually fought in that war, and they were injured through chemical weapons attacks. that were financed and provided by the West. So they have a long history of, combat and managing this conflict. So we have that. And so we bring it to the present day conflict. There was no war, and then suddenly there was war. Why now?
Well, I believe that this is where we talk about theatrics, and people don't like that word because they think that I'm talking about people, engaging in theater, which maybe I just need a better word. Wars are real in the sense that Mick, Fick, and Tick don't care about killing people. Like, there's even depopulation agenda, all sorts of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they don't care about killing people. Like, there's no humanity here. This is just balance sheet.
You're not undermining the seriousness of the war. My understanding is that you're saying that there are larger forces at play which render what is to happen as a foregone conclusion.
So one way of looking at it is, in order to protect yourself from sanctions, they had to create shadow networks that involved integrating with Russia, that often then go into the drug trafficking routes and weapons trafficking routes. And then you have this moral idea in your mind of what that means. But no, they're dealing with reality, survival. This is what you inflicted upon us. And this is how we survive. This is how we do it. Now, you could start with their drug traffickers, and stuff, and start there. We saw that on October the 7th, right? You start with these people are just, I won't say the words because for the algorithm, but all the things that they were accused, forgetting about the entire history. So if you start at a strategic moment, you control the narrative, and then you've got everything that you did in the operations of the past, 9/11, all that stuff. And people in the West have got no idea that ISIS was like Iran's number one enemy. But in their mind, this is the same thing.
They're all Muslim.
They're all like, because that was that you were meant to think that way. Yeah. The whole operation was to make you feel that way. And that's how you recruit an army. That's how you justify a war. There's no other way of doing it, because you have to maintain and preserve your local narrative, because the truth is that you are the terrorists and you can't tell people the truth because you are terrorizing for resources in a Game of Thrones. And so you need to put acceptable narrative on top and always create another. And so, bringing it to today. So if you start at that point, but there is genuine resistance. There is genuinely a country that has asymmetric advantage to defend itself from invasion. It has allegiances with Russia and China. It has technology that kind of breaks the previous empire. And there were documents in the US national security that talked about the closure of the Strait of Hormuz and what they would do. And they scenario planned it, and they knew exactly what would happen. And they knew that Iran had drones, and they knew that Iran had, missile capabilities. And so everything that happened was known of what could happen. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't go on a direction that's unknowable. Of course you can, and you adjust to that. And that's why you have derivatives markets to bet on every outcome, because you can't get everything right.
I think the point you're making is Iran hasn't done anything that the United States, the Pentagon in particular, did not anticipate the possibility of. And in fact, the Chief of Staff, Joint Chiefs of Staff, what's his name? General Kane, he actually warned of everything that played out.
Yes.
But they went ahead anyway.
Yes.
Because they were sold the idea that, one, the protests that were happening was a sign of people wanting to rise up and overthrow the regime. Two, that if they killed Ayatollah Khomeini, that killing the head of the snake, so to speak, would cause instability in the regime and it would fall apart. And that
actually, it would create unification.
That's right. Yeah. Well, sorry. They knew that it would create unification in terms of the defense establishment knew that. The Pentagon knew that. Mm-hmm. But at some point, at some meeting by somebody, I'll leave you to speculate, Trump was sold the idea and he bought into the idea that those things would happen, that it would be a very quick operation, and all we had to do was topple the head of the regime. That would create enough instability to encourage people to go onto the street and cause an uprising that would eventually lead to regime change.
Yeah.
Now, we know that the Pentagon did not believe in any of this, but Netanyahu and Israel sold that story to Trump convincingly enough for the war to be started.
Yeah, now this is where I try and go a layer higher of the deception. So that's the current story, which is we're controlled by Israel, and therefore we're doing this because Trump is allegedly engaged in a compromised network with Jeffrey Epstein. And somehow Mossad is able to persuade CIA and Pentagon and the military to take actions. And somehow the CIA just doesn't know this would happen, but Mossad does.
I don't think, no, sorry, just to be sure, I don't think that's what happened. I think they simply convinced Trump and he just told everybody else, we're going in.
Well, I believe Trump doesn't have the authority because he's controlled by his lobbies. And when I look at the game right now, Netanyahu is a MIC node. And remember, Israel has lobbies. Everyone thinks the buck stops at Israel, but who lobbies Netanyahu? Who lobbies the politicians in Israel? And some people come to the conclusion that that's just the top of the power structure. It's actually the MIC, the FIC, and the TIC. And so Israel was a node of the MIC. Trump is more aligned with the FIC because he's not. Although he's doing everything that looks like a neocon, he's not a neocon. He was brought in to, I believe, manage the transition of the world into a multipolar world and manage the transition to a one world technocratic government with China. And his job is to do deals. His job is to make that transition. So he has to appease the MIC, the factions of power aligned with this, give them a bunch of profit, let them blow up a load of bombs. But he's working for FIC. And what does FIC want? My underlying assumption when I look at capital markets, they want multipolarity. TIC want one world government. FIC want multipolarity. And the MIC are just legacy aligned with the US being the empire that rules the world, which is very aligned with Israel. Because the Greater Israel Project was destabilize the region, Sykes-Picot extension, in order to make sure that the Middle East can never use their resources and compete with America and the dollar and the petrodollar. And so that's Israel's role. Now we're moving to a world dominated by China, where they're all aligned with China. So if I were China, I would go to Iran and I would say, I'll keep buying your oil. We'll demonstrate how sanctions don't work, but we've got to expel Israel from the region because they represent the US MIC, and we've got to end the forever war because I want to invest in the Belt and Road Initiative across the entire region. I want you to grow as an economy, and I'd like you to buy all my product and our manufacturing base and keep supplying us with oil. I don't mind how long this goes on for because I'll keep buying it at 30% discount. Like, that's helping us. We're getting more gold in Shanghai while the West has just got derivatives contracts. We don't mind that. And so they're playing a two-way game. If Iran continues to be sanctioned, they get discounted oil and more gold that are coming through these routes. But if Iran can expel the US from the region, then you get fixed vision, which is transnational capital, which is aligned with China as well and integrated with the Gulf countries. So I'm looking at this and I'm looking at Trump administration one. What did he do? He assassinated Qasem Soleimani. Qasem Soleimani was the person that put together the resistance network and the weapons trafficking routes. He got eliminated and Iran reacted very weakly. It was very theatrical from my perspective.
They didn't do anything.
Yes. Well, they did a tit for tat. I think they did.
It was a symbolic
It
attack
was
on
symbolic.
a US base that they were pre-warned, that was abandoned, and there was not much damage.
That's what I call theatrics.
Sure.
It means it actually happened.
But that was a face-saving measure, though, rather than anything else. So
yeah. Well, what we want to do is we want to project our belief about what it is on top. So we have all this emotion of defending against imperialism, the injustice of the Palestinian cause, the how Israel, what they have done, and the lies and the deceit. We've got all that in our mind, and we connect that to the action.
Well, it's the human element again, which is why that's always pushed to us to sell a war, because that's what, as people, that's what we care about. We care about other people.
And that's what I always have to do. I always say I wear two hats. I wear a humanitarian hat and I wear an analytical hat, and they're completely opposite. When I put my humanitarian hat on, I was deeply impacted by what we've been witnessing in Palestine. I'm not the same human being on the human level. Like, I've witnessing a genocide in 4K in real time, and I showed up every single day. I've got friends that died. I've got. I will never see the world the same on the human element. I'm a different person.
The thing that stunned me most about that was the contrast in responses between ordinary people and the total indifference by institutions to just lie in their faces about what was happening there.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was stunned by that, to see that in real time and not just read about it as some kind of history.
Yeah,
we're talking, the EU, various German political leadership, all throughout the EU. In fact, all of the countries. It's not fair to just single out Germany, although they were probably the most egregious example.
Yeah, and the European Union
now. And it's like, actually, like, this is not representative of the sentiments of the people in Europe, actually, or any part of the world.
Every day I force myself to watch things that I never thought a human should ever watch in their life. And I said to myself every day, I don't want to watch this, but they're going through it, and the least I can do is watch it, and in the luxury of my own home, experience how it's changing me as a human. They're actually going through it.
Yeah,
that was their child.
Yeah, I've never seen anything.
Yeah,
anything that comes close to what I saw in Gaza.
And the worst thing is this has happened all along, and they hid it from us. We don't know. The story we were told in every war is completely one-sided BS. And so you learn how it is. Now then I step away from humanitarian. I say analytical. What's going on here? What's the capital flows? What leads to this? Whose agenda does that serve? And that's very inhumane. And so the impossibility of analyzing this situation is that everything I just did prior to when you just saw me as the real person was me being analytical. And that's a different person to the person that changed inside as a result of experiencing the death of so many people and their families. But the analytical side says that China has the capability and the plan to decolonize the Middle East. And
it seems to be happening without them, though.
Well, because China doesn't do PR. China just does. And so, this brings us to the Beijing meeting. But I believe China executed the whole thing with their allies. And China is aligned with both Iran and Saudi Arabia. And I believe there was a very large degree of coordination around what is going to be destroyed and what's going to be rebuilt and by who.
All right. So help me make sense of this, because my observations are a little bit at odds with that, but not entirely. So there could be, I think there's an opportunity to reconcile what you're saying with what I've seen so far. When this war was launched, Saudi Arabia and some of the other Gulf countries, they aided and abetted the attack on Iran. And it was only when Iran demonstrated its ability to defend itself, and by inflicting significant damage. And at first, what they did was, while it was significant, they were very restrained. They didn't, I think as Professor Pape says, they didn't just shoot through the escalation ladder. They said, you've done a certain amount of damage to us. We're going to demonstrate to you that we can also damage you. And if you keep going, you know that there are other targets that would impose a catastrophe on your country. And so as soon as they demonstrated that, I think the first country that came to their senses was Saudi Arabia. And there were some instances of what appeared to be false flag attacks to make it appear that Iran was continuing to attack Saudi Arabia. But I think their communication lines clarified that. But the UAE went hardcore, doubled down in their alliance with Israel and the United States against Iran. And it's only until perhaps this past week, that the UAE has put out some statements through various proxies demonstrating not a full back down, but perhaps a moderation of its stance against Israel. And we're yet to see where that leads to as well. So can you help me reconcile what I see with your view and where it's going?
So I think there's a degree of good cop and bad cop that is paid amongst transnational factions of power. And so there's no such thing as Iran in strategy. There are factions of power. There are factions of power within the IRGC that benefit from continual strategic tension between Iran and Israel. Mm-hmm. There are other factions of power within IRGC that share a changing dynamic. This is why I remember I spoke to my friend, like one of my Iranian friends that I work with a lot. He's British, but he's got an Iranian background and his parents are in Iran. And I said, look, what's the perception of the, IRGC and he said, well, you know what it really boils down to? There's a whole economy around the IRGC. And if you work for it, then your financial interest benefits from it. And if you don't work for it, your financial interest doesn't, and you're oppressed and you're not making any money and you're in the worst economic situation ever. He said, mostly it's just preservation of their own private interest. And I looked at that and said, that's the same in all politics, right? The boomers are voting for Trump because they want their stocks and real estate to go up. Mm-hmm. And the others are voting for Kamala Harris because they don't think they're ever going to own a house. And that's how politics works, right? You look at your individual situation, you say, am I benefiting from this or not? And that's how he described what, there are people that benefit from, they've got jobs, they work there. They're trying to maintain their household and their wealth and then they got business interests. And those business interests are involved in oil trade, banking, and different trades. And so you get at the incentives level when trying to understand that. And so there's a whole faction that wants the status quo. There's a faction that would benefit from change. And then there's every individual country's interest. And who are they subordinate to? And right now, Iran is 100% economically subordinate to China. That's just a reality. You can't change that reality. And their second largest trading partner is UAE.
Really?
Their first largest trading partner is China. Second largest trading partner is UAE. And UAE provide all of the infrastructure to allow Iran to circumvent sanctions. So there is a reality element and a theatrical element as well. The same happens between Saudi Arabia and UAE. I often talked about how they're making it look like they're in a battle, but they're divvying up power in a very coordinated way. It looks like to me that Saudi gets Yemen, UAE gets Israel to recognize Somaliland, Turkey gets their assets protected in Somalia, UAE gets their port protected in Somaliland, the Horn of Africa is protected. That's a vital trading route, but you've got to resolve the Strait of Hormuz. And so when you look at it from this perspective, you realize World War III is not possible. It's not possible. And then you look at China and US and you realize the mick, fick, and tick are dependent upon China in every aspect of their business model.
Yeah, well, the United States can't even go to war without Chinese production.
Exactly. So then you say there's reality by following monetary flows. And then there's theatrics. And the theatrics is, remember, it's also done covertly and overtly. You segregate who knows. It's on a need-to-know basis, right? That's the whole intelligence thing. So most people think that they're fighting a moral resistance, defending whether it's the Shia narrative excuse me, whether it's the Palestinian cause, that's what most people are defending. But then you've got the covert, and the covert, people want to say sellout, or they use these very emotionally charged words like, are you saying they're a sellout? No, I'm saying they came up with a plan based upon the reality of the situation. And I think China said, here's the future of the region, and it's going to be great. We got to show and embarrass America. The FIC said, we make shitloads of money out of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Iran said, we're going to be able to embarrass America. China said, we're going to have our moment. The Gulf countries said, we get to reconfigure here, and we'll hedge our bets. And you can look at all the transactions. All the transactions say everything that happened was known by China, known by Iran, known by Russia. And you can see the whole sequence in terms of what happened in Europe with the Nord Stream pipeline, what happened with Russia, Ukraine, what happened with Venezuela, what happened with Iran. You can see that's a long-term, multi-decade strategy all the way through. So to me, right from the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, Abraham Accords, all the things that happened there, all the way through to the current war, I believe that part of the negotiation was to close the Strait of Hormuz, agitate a war, and execute what needs to happen in order to move to the New World Order. And that New World Order was planned with the FIC, transnational capital, China, and the influence they can push upon the Gulf countries, Iran, Israel, and everyone. And they knew that there are people that need, if you go back to Iran, you say, who needs to go in order to make this happen? And a faction of power within Iran will have an opinion on that. And that faction of power may be the government aligned with China. And they'll say, this person, that person, never going to happen. Can you find a way where we eliminate them or you eliminate them? And China says, okay. I'm not saying this is what's happened. I'm just saying I imagine that this is how it might work. And they say, well, why don't we outsource it to Israel? And Israel needs this. Why don't they kill that person? You kill those bases. You retaliate like this and war game it out. Someone had a business plan, and that might be someone's business plan. It doesn't mean that that business plan works, because there'll be resistance against it and someone that does a false flag and tries to take it in a different direction. But I believe someone's business plan was to end up exactly where we are right now. And I personally believe the MOU's already been signed. And I personally believe in that MOU, there would have been Trump needs this narrative, Israel needs this narrative. In order to not have civil unrest and the IRGC to maintain its power structure, because we don't want to turn it into chaos, they need this narrative. And I know this just at the individual level as an investment banker. When we would do any deal in an investment bank, we would sign, this is when you say this is what you're allowed to say. If you violate that, that's a breach of NDA, the deal's over. And so you would literally plan out the whole public communications and the whole strategy of when you're allowed to speak to your staff, what you're allowed to say to your staff. And so to me, if it works at that level, why wouldn't it work at the geopolitical MOU sovereign level? And so right now, I believe an MOU's already been signed. A deal will be done.
So let's talk about that deal. I'm interested in how this war with Iran is going to resolve. And if we can start perhaps between, at the top, China and the United States. That's the top level that I see. So what's going to happen between them that's going to influence how this whole affair resolves?
Yeah, so if you look at the entire Trump administration, from the tariff war to the meeting in Beijing that we just had, that reveals it all. The tariff war was obviously, for anyone that actually did the analysis, going to drive everyone towards BRICS and China. It was going to lead to taxes on American businesses because they're an importer. it was going to lead to a power vacuum that would concentrate wealth up to transnational capital. And it was going to cause stress in the export-dependent countries to renegotiate deals. And every renegotiation ended us closer to a multipolar world and America being a regional power. Everything he's done has deconstructed everything that made the US empire by its covert empire, and signaled to the entire global South and the Middle East, America's not a reliable partner, China is. Every single thing. Now, on the narrative, we said Trump's an idiot, he's crazy, he's MAGA, he's nationalist. Everyone makes their own narrative, and those are engineered very carefully. But in the end, what happened? They met in Beijing. And who came? Trump, with executives that answer to boards and shareholders in transnational capital that make up about $1 trillion of net worth from the MIC, Tick, and FIC. The MIC were kind of left behind because there was Boeing there, and some of but the more sensitive ones are left behind. You're the patriots, but it was Tick and FIC. Tick and FIC have no allegiance to America, and so they were all there. And Trump gets off the plane, and Xi Jinping doesn't meet him. Okay, what do we interpret by that? And then he goes through a ritual with loads of children with Chinese flags waving. And then he goes to meet Xi Jinping. And you had the executives behind Trump with Xi Jinping leading the way. And then you had the dinner afterwards and the public press release with Trump on a lower chair and Xi Jinping on a higher chair. To make it, that was not signaling to America or American audience. That was a signal to the rest of the world. This is the new power. Okay? So that was all laid out. You don't go to a meeting in order to start a negotiation. You go to a meeting for photos. Geopolitics is just optics when it becomes at the press level. That's not, okay, we're going to start negotiating. What are we going to do? That's, we've been negotiating, and now we've hit a checkpoint, and now we need a photo op to tell the rest of the world. And so that meeting was the photo op. I call it a check-in meeting. Just like throughout the whole Iran side, there were check-in meetings. There were negotiations before the war. There were negotiations during the war. There'll be negotiations after the war. And they're checking in. And all the people that were at the negotiations before the war in Iran are still alive today. Still the same people. Archie, Galavant. You've already seen. And they're creating we fought till the end. We did everything. We broke the empire. They had to do a deal. We crushed them. That's what you need for preservation, right? On Trump's side, he needs a different narrative. We force them to do it, and that's not working too well right now. So he needs this final Hollywood movie. He needs something that says, we did it because I forced them to do it. And he hasn't quite got
there. There was an
yet.
admission, actually, that kind of leaked out of the administration, is that the people who are managing the negotiations on behalf of Trump have told the Iranian side, just disregard anything he says publicly, because that's to massage the domestic audience
Correct.
to the message.
See, we get the truth.
So that we can actually manage this outcome. So there seems to be like two tracks of information flow. One on the inside that's dealing with the reality of who won this war, really. I mean, the war was over in the first week, to be honest with you. And so now they're sort of negotiating how to manage the perception of the outcome for both parties.
Correct. So there are factions of power, the MIC and the FIC and the TIC in America, that don't necessarily want this war to end until China says so, and they have to. And so they're happy to keep the Strait of Hormuz closed for as long as possible, because big oil and big LNG are getting new contracts. The stock market's crushing it, is loving it. Mm-hmm. You get the opportunity to destroy other countries and concentrate wealth upwards. You get to price out people with inflation. This is concentration of power dream. Trump's power structure doesn't want the Strait open. But it's bounded escalation. They don't want oil prices at like, $250 that destroys everything globally. The bond markets are really determining, whether America is going to be able to refinance its debt or not. And the stock market's loving it. So what is he trying to price? What's really happening here? I think Trump needs to time the opening of the Strait of Hormuz with the SpaceX IPO and the OpenAI IPO and the Anthropic IPO, because those are going to make and break the stock market.
Mm-hmm.
And the bond market's showing distress right now. And it's almost like I need stocks to do well, and these IPOs are everything. We flipped the entire world upside down for AI and robotics. I need liquidity, massive liquidity. Let's get the Strait open and time it with that.
It does feel all of those IPOs have been orchestrated to coincide.
Yes.
At the same time.
Yeah. And so we rush all them through, and they're going to make or break the stock market. They have to succeed. It needs massive liquidity, like massive. I'm a little bit split about whether they're trying to do a buy the rumor, sell the news and crash scenario, or they've got a lot more to go. I'm slightly thinking they've got a lot more to go. But when the Fed needs to, they need to engineer the crisis. So we got the regime change at the Fed. We got Kevin Walsh. And they need a big print. The only solution to America is a big print. 7 trillion, 10 trillion. The AI bubble is the perfect story for a bailout narrative.
Yeah.
So they're building all of that. They have to get the Fed to buy the bonds because yields are going insane. And, foreign investors are all selling their treasuries. Even Japan's doing it now. And if UK goes into crisis and they start selling, and Europe, that's a problem. They even had to give UAE an FX swap line to stop them selling their bonds. So you can't have anyone, you can't let them sell their bonds. So the buyer has to be the Fed. So I think they're timing a pump and dump cycle. I'm not sure of the exact timing of it. I think they want the opening of the Strait of Hormuz to coincide with the IPOs. I think they've already signed the MOU. And what happened right after the Beijing meeting? Xi Jinping did one thing and one thing only: exert that Taiwan is a red line. And that's semiconductor chips. That's the AI.
Trump
trade.
all but conceded.
Yeah, Trump came out even before the meeting. America cancelled a $13 billion MIC contract with Taiwan right before the meeting, and signed off on selling some more NVIDIA chips to China, which China declined. So everyone that was at that meeting needed China, and so they were there to make sure, are our supply chains okay? Apple is saying, are our factories' lights going to be on? I know you've got Huawei, but are you going to continue to allow us to make iPhones? Elon was saying, am I going to be able to get our rare earth minerals? I know that we need the whole Congo thing and M23. That's all the cobalt that goes into the batteries and EVs. And there's tension between the different powers there in the African side, but that's a deviation. Am I going to be able to get my components? So every single one that was there, Visa, MasterCard. Okay, so you've got 122 countries connected to SIPs now. You've got UAE doing central bank digital currencies. You've got Iran leaning into Bitcoin. Are we going to be able to integrate our rails into your rails in this transnational cooperation? This was really just the TIC. That meeting was a meeting between the TIC, the FIC, and China. And that's the one world government layer, AI layer. These are the two powers making sure that the MIC, FIC, and TIC get their components. And Xi Jinping said, Taiwan's our red line. Don't touch Taiwan. And so they put together a plan, which is, how do you get your chips? How do we get our chips? And we get Taiwan. Let's not go to world war. We're not going to world war. There was never a plan to go to world war because MIC needs China. So it doesn't make sense. And then what happened right after the meeting is you got managed shipments coming out. There was like about 20 to 30 shipments immediately. And the strait started opening bit by bit by bit. There was more and more shipments every single day. And then there's managed theater around the MOU. So we're just leading up to the exit narrative. What's Israel going to say? What's Iran going to say? What's America going to say? Do we need another escalate to de-escalate? I don't know, but it will be theatrical if we do, because they haven't got anything that indicates that this is Iraq, or that they're going to do a ground invasion, or that any of that's even none of it's possible. And everyone knew before this that none of that's possible. There's no like we accidentally found this out by trying because Trump's stupid and he's just signing, like doing things and logging into Truth Social every day. His job is to look like he's doing the MAGA narrative.
What's going to happen to the petrodollar?
There's two components to the petrodollar. The second half of that is the purchase of US treasuries. And so they gave UAE an FX swap line. An FX swap line is a very exclusive club that no one in the Gulf has ever been invited to, not even Saudi Arabia. And that was a club just for the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan, the European Central Bank, the Swiss Central Bank, and the Bank of Canada.
What is a swap line?
Okay, imagine, so UAE has $250 billion in treasuries and $2 trillion in assets. Vast majority being a chunk of it being AI and American equities, and that all of the major Magnificent Seven and all of the most important companies in America. An FX swap line says that your central bank can deposit some of your local currency at ours, and then the Fed will create some dollars, and you get those dollars collateralized by your currency. And so we'll take your currency. Now, in UAE, it's pegged to the dollar. So that's a very low risk trade. But you're handing over to UAE the ability to create dollars like the Bank of Japan. That turns UAE into a global financial center like the Bank of Japan. That's a very exclusive club that they don't give away. If you're doing that for someone like Argentina, like they did, Argentinian currency risk is off the scale. UAE dinar is pegged to the dollar. So this is just enhancing the financial center in Dubai with a narrative of they're doing it in distress. Why? Because they're getting retail to sell all their assets and BlackRock's buying them all. The ETF of UAE is going up and the institutional ownership of UAE is going up. That's a FIC managed transition. They're building their financial center in UAE by manufacturing a crisis, doing the same in India as well for BRICS. So FIC is building the multipolar layers. BRICS penetration through India, UAE penetration into the GCC. So they got their FX swap line. Now, what Scott Bessent said is that UAE came out and said they did some very strategic moves. Everyone was saying UAE's dead. It's no one's going to go back. Okay, that leads to retail selling. You even saw that in the gold to Bitcoin price. People were selling their physical gold, buying Bitcoin, and you could sell your gold at a discount so that they could get out of UAE and all that stuff. But prior to that, they'd already signed. They got the Enbridge project, the network of CBDCs. Now they got the Federal Reserve dollar creation mechanism. They got Abraham Accords that allows them to buy Israeli assets. Netanyahu's been privatizing many companies. UAE's been buying them. India's been buying the ports in Israel. UAE's been buying the defense shares. Gulf have been buying up Israel, which gives them voting rights, board seats, control. Everyone is led to believe Israel's ruling the world. They're buying them. They're buying America. They're buying Israel. They're doing it with Chinese money. Then UAE also signed an energy pricing pact with BRICS for oil, and then left OPEC. OPEC was the petrodollar. OPEC was the mechanism for pricing oil in dollars and buying US treasuries that stay at the Fed and enforce them to use the treasury yield to buy defense, prop up the US stock market, the MIC. If OPEC, if UAE leaves and they've got an agreement with BRICS, and what happened prior to this? Iran, Egypt, and UAE and Ethiopia and Saudi as an observer joined BRICS. That all happened prior to this. So again, the public narrative is that Saudi Arabia and UAE are at it, but this is breaking the petrodollar bit by bit. Now, they don't want to break it. They definitely don't want to break it. Like, they want to be the Gulf countries and Iran. They want to be the central. This is a compelling vision. China's got the manufacturing base. America's got the capital markets. We sit in the middle. So who's going to control the petrodollar and the petro-yuan? Well, what happens with Iran? If you give Iran sanction relief, now they're not selling their oil to China at a 30% discount through the covert UAE rails. Now they're going to have 2 to 4 million barrels of oil to come to the market. Is that going to be priced in yuan, or is that going to be priced in dollars? Is that going to be priced in Bitcoin? Is that going to be, the stable coins suddenly got seized, the DeFi contracts got frozen, the Bitcoin remained. And so what we're doing here is we're getting UAE as a network of central bank digital currencies, Iran as a Bitcoin haven, and Saudi Arabia as the head of the GCC, because they've got the good cop role. UAE gets the bad cop role, Saudi gets the good cop role. Saudi looks great. They saved the crisis. They managed to get the alternative pipelines past the Strait of Hormuz. You weaken the Strait of Hormuz, but they get sanction relief, and everyone builds their alternative pipelines and alternative rails. OPEC has effectively has killed the petrodollar in a managed transition where who at the end of this, depending on what the MOU says, depending on what the end deal says with Iran, UAE, and Saudi control the petro-yuan and the petrodollar. And that's really big. That's a really big change. China doesn't want just Saudi having the power. America doesn't want just UAE. The FIC doesn't want just UAE. They want to penetrate. So now you've got UAE represents the FIC, Saudi and Iran competing powers that China can manage for the petro-yuan and petrodollar. To me, that's the perfect construct of a managed transition away from the petrodollar. And the petrodollar is what gives America its power today.
What happens to United States military bases in the Middle East? Will they be rebuilt?
So they were originally set up for the MIC forever war model, which is the goal of a forever war is simply to spend as much money as possible, get the Americans to pay for it, the Brits to pay for it, the Europeans to pay for it, and the money goes into the stock market through defense contracts. And the idea is that war is more profitable than defense, but eventually you transition from the forever war to defense, real defense. And real defense means you're not there to agitate a war. You're there to ensure that everything's working nicely and you're protecting the investments that the FIC has made. And so those bases needed to be destroyed and rebuilt. And I think they're sat around a table with a term sheet between the FIC, the China Belt and Road Initiative, and the Gulf Sovereign Wealth Funds. And the FIC is negotiating what's the split to make sure we don't need to bomb each other and we have regional stability. How much money can we make out of regional stability with a normalized Iran, no more resistance, the Gulf countries, and a weakened Israel? And that's a very compelling vision. That's why you don't need the resistance anymore if you're moving to that. But how do you change the previous narrative? You have to have economic contracts that tie everything together. That's why you're not going to get a sudden deal. This is 30-day, 60-day, 90-day, 2-year. This is an M&A deal. This is...
You mentioned about the resistance axis. You got Hezbollah and various proxies, as they're called, that Iran supports. How can it be possible for Iran to accept the possibility of not supporting them? If you have so many unresolved issues, you have southern Lebanon effectively taken over by Israel. Gaza is reoccupied now by Israel. You have the West Bank currently being and it's basically annexed. Let's face it. When the new regime came into force in Syria, Israel took immediate opportunity to take land, including and up to Mount Hermon and the ski resorts there. A lot of people don't know that Syria has a ski resort mountain. It seems unlikely to me that Iran says, okay, Syria is gone and will not.
I think Iran did say that already. Yeah, there's no way that Turkey could have done that operation without China, Russia, and Iran agreeing to it.
Okay, interesting.
Not possible.
Okay, and then what happens to the rest of that?
So Syria is Turkey and GCC. I think that's already done. They put a placeholder in. Get your ex-ISIS guy, but remember he's not ideologically aligned.
So you don't think Iran will resist that to reassert itself on Syria?
No.
Okay.
So Syria is just, there's a placeholder, and his job is to just be a placeholder and make sure it doesn't turn into chaos. And this is why what do? You need to kick the can down the road a bit, because these are big issues, like big issues. So Iran's issue was, right, we've signed a deal, but they had a holdout clause around Lebanon. That's an acceptable public narrative. I'm not dumping the resistance, and we're trying to include it in the deal, but we're being forced to take them out. So you have that public tension. I believe that Iran's already stopped supporting Hezbollah. I believe that factions of power in Iran allowed that pager attack to happen. I believe that October the 7th was meant to happen. I don't think these were organic moves. I believe the helicopter that regime changed the Iranian government was an inside job.
Oh, you're talking about the crashing the mountains a few years ago, right?
Yeah. Yep. The reason is if it were Israel or if it were real, you'd have an uproar. When a government is very quiet about an assassination or a helicopter that falls down with their own government, then sometimes that means it's an inside job. So I think Iran has regime changed itself in order to preserve the type of government that is still IRGC, but is aligned with China's vision of regional stability. And there are people in there that are very influential factions of power that needed this to happen covertly, and they're no longer alive today. And so I think factions of power within Iran did an inside job. And the reason there's subtle things. I remember we talked about Syria, that Syria, I believe, couldn't have happened without Iran, Russia, and China agreeing to it. Just like Venezuela couldn't have happened without Iran, China, and Russia agreeing to it. Because they were all prepared. Like China was lining up all of its oil, and you could see all the movements prior to the Venezuela operation. That was agreed from my perspective. And that's what these check-ins are. They're resetting the maps. They're saying, you're going to get Ukraine. We need another 3 years of war, Russia. We need to make another $1 trillion. We need to destabilize Europe and vassalize them. You're going to have Taiwan. Let's settle. What are we going to do with chips? Okay, well, we need a bit of a brain drain. So we'll have the CHIPS Act. We'll build some new plants in Arizona. Some of the people that are more, the Taiwanese that are more American-centered, they'll come over here and we'll brain drain Taiwan. The rest of them that are more China-aligned, because Taiwan's going to be China. So therefore, the ones that are preparing for the future, they're going to be China-aligned. And you let them, and we do the whole Huawei integration and build our own chips. And then eventually we do what we did in Hong Kong. We'll just get more aggressive, and America, you ain't going to do shit because this is the world order. And in exchange for that, we'll give your companies, we'll give Elon what he needs, we'll give Apple what they need, but on China's terms. You can have our manufacturing base, but we get to copy everything. We get to do what we need. We get to accelerate, as China has always done. Apple, you can build your iPhone here, but we're going to get the people that are building iPhones to build Huawei as well. We're going to get the people that are building Teslas to do BYD too. And now we're accelerating at a faster pace anyway, so we're on our own track. And that's why you got to come to the table, because we could get rid of Apple now. We could kill your stock market. China can structurally break the commodities market, all the derivatives contracts, because they got all the gold. They could break the bond market by selling their treasuries and investing in Belt and Road. And they could break the stock market by showing what DeepSeek and Huawei's capabilities are. 10 times cheaper, 90% of the efficiency, and everything's produced here. And we could chuck you out. So we could break your stock market, bond market, and commodity market. Come down here, and all we got to do is figure out what to do with Taiwan. Then we got to figure out what we're going to do with Iran. And what we want a Middle East that is now West Asia. And that means that we're going to, Israel, you're no longer there to destabilize the region. You got to figure out what your new role is. And remember, Israel has a lobby of Israel. Most people think Netanyahu's in charge. Netanyahu is a paid agent. And all the politicians in Israel are captured by the same lobby power that has captured America. So it's the corporate interest that's ruling the game. And that's transnational capital.
They do seem to have an independent view. A view that's independent of the industrial complex as you've laid out. That is still expansionist, and that
but
has
private. But private. It has a very state-owned.
Okay, it has a very biblical origin though. So it's like deeply embedded in culture, the theology, the history, and they even wear that that Greater Israel patch on their uniforms, right? So it is a kind of a historic vision and a mission for them to re-establish that.
Oh, absolutely. That is the public narrative to recruit soldiers. But who owns the assets in Israel? Look at the Israel ETF, BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. Where does all the money from Israel go? Back into the US stock market. Israel is a plausible deniability story for American MIC to commit crimes against humanity. And when they need plausible deniability and a divorce, they can just say it was them. It wasn't us.
So when does Syria
America
get its land back?
America did that genocide.
So when does Syria get its land back? The recently acquired land. I'm not even talking about Golan, right? The Golan Heights.
So what happened with Syria? So they put ex-ISIS Jelani in. He's a GCC Turkey puppet funded by Turkey. He immediately went to meet Trump in the White House. Trump introduced him to BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, and Citibank and JP Morgan. He turned down the IMF loan and immediately started divvying up what does the FIC need to invest in to achieve regional stability with Gulf money and China's Belt and Road Initiative. And so they're divvying up the transactions, and they'll say, well, we'll invest, but you got to make sure that these factions of power don't have an uprising, the old Assad-connected power structures. And anytime you need some help, we'll just manufacture a narrative. You're killing the Christians, we're killing the Muslim, whatever Tucker Carlson says, we'll just create a narrative that helps you get rid of those factions of power and do some massacres or something. But his job is to achieve regional stability for Syria and negotiate the right balance of Gulf money, Turkish money, FIC money, and Chinese money. As is Egypt right now, as is Turkey, and they're coming after the currency.
So the issue of their land is still at the forefront of my mind.
Yeah, FIC's trying to get as much as they can. And they want to front run the deal, and then they'll do sanction relief in order to make sure that they get the returns on it. But they'll allow, maybe a tiny bit for the Syrian people, but it will be GCC, China, and FIC owned, I think, and Turkey. Turkey doesn't have the money. Turkey's got the muscle. Gulf has got the money. China's got the ability to build. And the Syrian people get the last part after all the insider deals have done with FIC. but it will be a regional stability model, which will be significantly better than what it was.
And southern Lebanon, how's that going to be resolved?
Okay, that's the hardest. So Iran invested most in Hezbollah. Hezbollah, so what they're doing, I think they're buying time. So the current game is that when Israel does a ground invasion, they get wrecked by Hezbollah and their tanks get destroyed. And when Israel comes in by the air, Hezbollah is what they do is they come in by the air, they kill civilians, they destroy civilian infrastructure, they make 1.6 million Lebanese lose their home, and then that agitates a reaction from Hezbollah. That's the current game at the moment right now. So I think Israel is being weakened and Hezbollah is being weakened at the same time. And then eventually it will go into a political process that integrates Hezbollah into the Lebanese army. They've already got, representation within government. So just like the Houthis signed a deal with Saudi Arabia in Yemen, Yemen. I'm losing my mind. Just like Hezbollah, the Houthis signed a deal with Saudi Arabia in Yemen, and now they're going to be integrated into the political process once is the appropriate time. And they didn't get involved. They could have, closed the Red Sea at the same time as Strait of Hormuz. Then we're kind of in a real war, right? That's kind of, we're all at it, we're all fighting. That's a non-theatrical. To me, this is way more planned and bounded escalation, hitting strategic choke points and trying to get better negotiation terms there. So Lebanon, it ties into, I believe there needs to be a regime change in Israel. So they're going to blame Netanyahu for everything. At some point, they're going to reveal that October the 7th was allowed to happen. There's going to be civil unrest in Israel. A lot of Israelis have already started to invade Argentina, Ukraine, Thailand, and Cyprus. Like Cyprus is completely invaded by Israelis. You talk about the Muslim invasion in UK. This is the Israeli invasion in Cyprus. Like my friends in Cyprus are saying, like, it's not a nice place at the moment.
Why? Because there are tensions between local population and the Israelis moving there, or?
Well, Cyprus is a difficult place, right? It's got the Turkish part, it's got the Cypriot part, and it's got the British base. And now you're getting the Israelis like all coming in droves, and it's a small place, and
really small.
Yeah, it's a really small place if you've ever been. Just like they're ratcheting up the whole immigration demographic changes around Europe and UK at the moment. This is causing some issues within Cyprus, and there was a whole tit for tat around whether US could use the British bases in Lebanon and all that stuff. We're starting to see Europe. I keep jumping around, then we'll get back to Lebanon. But there was a regime change in Hungary. And so Erdogan, is that his name?
Erdogan is in Turkey.
Yeah. So, who's it in Hungary?
I didn't catch the name.
Orban. There we go.
Viktor Orban was
Orban.
ousted. He lost the election, yeah.
Yeah, now remember, he's really important because he was selling his vote to Russia, which was stopping the unanimity vote in the European Union to release the Ukrainian funds to be used, the Russian funds to be used by Ukraine.
Gotcha, yeah.
But he was also selling his vote to Israel. So he was stopping the sanctions of the West Bank by European Union. Those are all kicking off now. So now you've regime changed Hungary. European Union is actually doing some interesting stuff. Firstly, Germany's now start to take all of its manufacturing base and build its own military industrial complex. So the old car manufacturing are becoming, we got a couple of IPOs coming up for German military companies. So, BlackRock starting to diversify into a German military industrial complex as a result of destroying the manufacturing base and the energy crisis. They're starting to sanction Israel on West Bank side. So there's a political process that's starting there very strategically, I think at the right time. And you get the Russian money for Ukraine. And now Ukraine's getting more aggressive than ever in destroying energy infrastructure and agitating Russia further and further. So I think they negotiated another 3 years of war, I've always believed, to destroy Europe and really destabilize Europe. And Russia's going to get Ukraine, and BlackRock's getting all the land negotiations. The IMF, via the Bank of England, collateralized all the land in Ukraine. They'll end up with all the grain and stuff. And so I think they've divvied up what's going to happen to Ukraine, but they need a few more years of war to steal all the resources. And even there was that leak, where America said, well, we're going to use Ukraine to the last Ukrainian, and that's becoming a reality. That's how brutal the Mick are.
Yeah.
And then you get the whole theater between NATO and Trump, and now all of a sudden, every government in Europe that's in a crisis needs to spend 5% of their budget on weapons.
Yeah.
And it starts to build a... So what I think Mick, Fick and Tick are doing, and then we'll get back to Lebanon. Yeah. Mick, Fick and Tick are building for a multipolar world. They're vassalizing countries and building Mick, Fick and Ticks globally so that they can integrate them. And the only country they can't penetrate is China. So they need to negotiate with China, and they'll make much more money by connecting all the payment and financial rails. And they're using US assets to get as much leverage as possible. The US military is a for-rent militia for the FIC right now. They say, go create chaos there and then get us more penetration there so that when America's a regional power, we've got our multipolar layers all set up. And that's what's happening. Cuba's next, I guess. But with Lebanon, I think you need to get rid of Netanyahu to blame shift. And I think the next leader of Israel.
That feels inevitable. You just feel like that's going to happen. He's going to be the scapegoat, even though the next layer of leadership and pretty much most of the political establishment is in lockstep with everything he's done.
Yeah, so we'll enter into a political process that will look like the next leader is a radical Zionist as well, because that's how you can get the vote. You've got to galvanize the radical Zionists in Israel that are more radicalized than ever as a result of all of this. And Iran got that, that was a big loss for Israel once this deal is signed. So you regime change Netanyahu, you put a new leader that looks like they're going to be like Netanyahu or a Smotrich or a Gavir, or everything. You use their disgusting rhetoric, push it out in the media so that everyone hates Israel, strategically weaken it, the stock market gets all the value, privatize everything, and then the Gulf countries come in and buy. And so what did Trump do? He said, we've got a deal, but everyone needs to sign Abraham Accords. What does that do? Now, every country in the Middle East is now on a new negotiation track with Fick, Mick and Tick. And so he's now saying...
They've all rejected that, though.
They've all rejected... And Saudi came out and said what it always has said.
Yeah.
We'll do it, but only if there's a viable, sustainable solution to Palestine. So Saudi is good cop. Saudi gets to say, we're committed to Palestine. Europe gets to start going aggressive on West Bank. Israel gets acquired by UAE in the Gulf countries and India. They become a puppet regime for Mick, Fick, Tick, but under regional stability with a new narrative, a rebranded Israel. Palestine becomes a state, and then slowly...
You think that's going to happen?
Yes, that's going to happen. I'll bet anything on that. Palestine will be a state. But it will be owned by the GCC. And so all of the investment, if board and peace still persists, it's all going to be Gulf money. And no one invested but the Gulf. And they're going to say, well, we want it on our terms. And so they're going to buy as much influence over Israel. They're going to fund the rebuild of Palestine. And the West Bank is going to be strategically weakened via EU narrative in exchange for them complying with war and everything that needs, and destabilization. So the Bank for International Settlements gets everything, pushes it out to its network of central banks. They go multipolar. And I think eventually in the next 5 years, I could see this one's more speculative, but let me put a bit of hope in here. I could see a one-state solution with an Arab majority. Whether it would be called Israel or whether it would be called Palestine, maybe it's a two-state solution. But I reckon over the next 5 years we're gonna see that whole destabilization campaign of Israel, that Greater Israel project, is being pushed to the limit right now to give Fick more power because Netanyahu has switched his position. He doesn't work for Mick anymore. He works for Fick. And so his job is to get as much land into these negotiations to do what he's always done, which is when Israel gets land, they negotiate normalization in exchange for returning the land. But it was always under the forever war model. So they were always manufacturing a narrative for war. I personally believe that China does not want an Israel that represents the MiC in the region. And I think China has the leverage to enforce it. You're just not going to get the press release.